All right, Mike, gonna let you introduce yourself.
Mike Pryor. Most of y'all know me. If not, Cynthia and I have been in CTBA for over 20 years. And the reason I'm doing this is because I happen to fly in and out of airspace as a fixed wing pilot. And so I kind of got volunteered to do this. And it's a reminder of, some FARs and just as a preparation for everyone going out to Albuquerque to remind us that yes, indeed, we must function legally within the airspace. So let me share my. I actually tried to keep this pretty simple, and wanted to keep it to about 30 minutes. And the main reason we wanted to talk about this is, you remember last month, Bill Broker brought up the fact that the FAA has been very diligent in confirming our adherence to FARs and such. And we found that there have been, we expect that there will be a number of ramp checks and such at Albuquerque. And so just as a reminder to folks that the main reason that we adhere to the airspace requirements is basically because of safety. It's the most fundamental reason why we are having this conversation. But also our pilot certifications are at risk if we fail to comply with the federal aviation regulations. And furthermore, if we find ourselves in a difficult spot with the FAA, or if someone reports us for violating airspace, and that includes weather restrictions, then we obviously our insurance is also at risk. So there's some obvious safety and is the most important, but there are also some monetary considerations and pilot certification considerations why we discuss airspace. Need to be reminded of these little details from time to time. Obviously, the pilot's the primary responsibility, but I wanted to touch on, if we can, how chase crew can assist the pilot throughout the flight, especially if you're in a challenging environment, a new environment. If you go to a rally, you go to Plano and there's more airspace to be worried about. We used to have to worry about it down in Houston at Ballooner, but it does help if the chase crew is aware, and if the pilot's focused on flying the balloon and maybe avoiding power lines, sometimes the chase crew might be able to give a hint or two about the airspace if they've been properly briefed. So I think the most important part of that for pilots is to remember that, if you're in a difficult airspace environment, that during pre-flight, you can advise the chase crew how they might be able to assist you, landmarks, or possibly even carrying a chart. But more importantly, nowadays with the new apps, you can actually see the various airspace defined on the map itself. So if you've got a chase crew that's got a tablet or moving map on their phone, they can probably be able to help you, advise you when you're approaching some sort of airspace boundary that might be a consideration. So I know we usually don't talk about that. Actually, Gordon Swanskowski has pointed this out several times in some of his articles and some of his briefings, that chase crew can actually play an important role. Not obviously not primary responsibility, but be able to assist through advising the pilot when he might be approaching the boundaries of a new airspace. I want to rely mostly on Adam McGee's Balloon Training Academy presentations. And Adam, if you're not familiar with him, he's a great instructor pilot. His wife, Kim McGee, it's internationally acclaimed female competition pilot. He's also a designated pilot examiner, and has done 3 last year did 3 great articles in Ballooning Magazine. First one about navigating the national airspace system. Second was to communicate or not to communicate. That is the question. And the third one, ADSB transponders and weather minimums. Oh my! And you see the dates of those magazines. I would highly recommend those for the BFA members. If you could go look those up and read those articles. And I've actually borrowed a couple of his slides and thoughts throughout this presentation. But a great set of articles again that I would recommend. Obviously, this is all based upon FAR's Federal Aviation Regulations, Part 71, which defines the airspace, and Part 91, which talks about procedures, and then descriptions that we find in the Aeronautical Information Manual for those of you that might have a copy of that. I don't know. Can you see me? No, probably not.
Right here.
Just that's the only thing. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the only one. Yes, I'll show you this. Everyone should be familiar with the FARs. You can look all this up online these days. Just go to FAA.gov and find almost anything you want these days digitally instead of having to go buy a big old book. Anyway, so Adam talks about this. This is his diagram. And I'm having a presentation issue because it's off-centered. Sorry about that. And he starts off talking about Class G airspace. I'm going to start off talking about Class A airspace just to rule it out. It's the least used by balloon pilots. I see we got Brenda there, and I think Sherry was on earlier. Occasionally, we'll see gas balloons that'll venture up into Class A with special waivers or special coordination with ATC, air traffic control. Or if someone's going to do a high altitude record flight, for instance, you might go into Class A, but otherwise it's the least used by balloons, unless you're Baumgartner or somebody that wants to, jump out of one at 100,000 feet or something. But actually that's above Class A. The purpose of this particular chart is to point out the changes that came about in the past few years with the automatic dependent surveillance broadcast requirement, which is transitioning from the old transponder with mode C for altitude to a satellite-based system, and it's part of next gen for the FAA, and transitioning from ground-based radars to everything satellite-based and GPS-based. So the ADSB requirements are quite restrictive for ballooning because without an electrical system, it's really tough to actually install and fly with ADSB and be compliant. So I'm starting off by filtering out the least used airspace, and Class A drops off at 18,000 feet and above. Next most restrictive is Class B airspace, which does require ADSB, and it also requires direct communication to enter and to fly throughout the Class B airspace. So it is also generally quite restrictive and very uncommon for ballooning. There is the Mode C veil around a Class B airspace. Those that are around, down Houston or up in Dallas may fly around in that airspace. And it does allow you to fly in that. It's a 30-mile radius that has a number of restrictions, but you're able to fly outside of the actual Class B inverted wedding cake and fly underneath these areas. And I think you can probably all see that this Class B has some vacant areas around there where, with these exceptions, you can fly below the ceiling of the Class B and still be legal. There are certain exceptions. People have gotten waivers and coordinated with ATC to fly both in Class A and Class B, but it's highly restrictive, and I will defer that to another session. That's a little bit more detailed than we want to get into today. Class C is our next class, and as you see here, the ADSB is required. It technically goes from surface up to 10,000 feet for ADSB, so you can't fly over the top of it, but you can fly underneath it. And I don't know if you can see my cursor here. Let's see, I can move my cursor a little bit.
Yep.
This area right underneath here, underneath this shelf, we often fly underneath these shelves, and it doesn't require ADSB, but there are other restrictions we'll talk about here in a moment. So basically, I'm ruling out Class A, Class B, and most of Class C as requiring ADSB, advanced avionic equipment generally to fly in those areas, except by special waiver. Which brings us down into our areas that we typically would fly within. Already mentioned the Class A and the Class B. And those again, A and B are positive control airspace, and you definitely need to talk with air traffic control to come in, to go out, to move around. And their weather minimums are based upon the assumption that you're under positive control. Now in Class C, like Austin-Bergstrom, now we started to get in an area where we might encounter, we might have the ability to fly underneath, in and around Class C airspace. And these are large airports across the country that aren't the special large-scale airports like Dallas and Houston. They have radar approaches and scheduled airlines. And the typical space is there's a 5-mile circle that's surface to 4,000 feet. And then out to 10 miles, it starts at about 1,200 up to 4,000 feet. And so if you go, I'm going to move down here on this. I don't have the entire. Here it is. So as you can see, the Central Texas airspace has become quite congested. And, all the way up from Georgetown to Taylor to now executive is Class D, and now to Class C, Austin-Bergstrom, and even on down to San Marcos and Lockhart and the Kyle area. Whether you're flying north or south of Austin, I mean, you're pretty much, there's controlled airspace all around. And so if you were ever in a situation where you might want to transit this airspace, you'll notice that there's some contact frequencies here for Austin approach control. You can actually usually do it in advance, but you can actually pop up and fly and talk to Austin-Bergstrom. I know we used to do it before. And you can actually fly underneath this large double ring is the Class C airspace around Austin, that if you were to fly out of Kyle and fly northwest, technically you fly underneath that. It's preferred that you make contact, but it's not necessary that you fly under ATC control as you fly over here by Creedmoor, for instance, and you could land underneath the shelf legally without actually contacting Austin-Bergstrom. Now, obviously with balloons and flying VFR, visual flight rules, see and avoid is the main concept, and most fixed wing are going to be able to see you well before you see them. And I think that's the biggest challenge for balloonists, is that we typically are flying low and outside of the airspace, so we really don't see a lot of planes, and they're able to see and avoid and not cause a flight conflict. But if, for instance, you have planes flying into or out of Class C airspace on vectors, or maybe even flying into San Marcos down here below, they may be on a vector from ATC, and it would be preferential that you make contact with ATC if you're going to be in and about their operating area. We'll talk a little bit more of that in a minute. But it's one of the things that Adam points out in his article is that it's better to communicate than not to communicate. I know we tend to, sometimes not even carry an aircraft radio, but is certainly in dense airspace, if you're going to be flying in and around this airspace, for safety reasons, it's obviously preferred that you do make contact, or at least announce that you're flying, balloon with your N number, flying at 1,000 feet or whatever, or 500 feet, whatever. If you're in the vicinity of one of these airfields, just to give the controllers a heads up, and any other pilots that are concerned about your intentions. So again, Adam, as a DPE, promotes communication over staying silent. So I support that as a fixed wing pilot also. So Class C, we just talked about that right here around Austin. It's kind of a small inverted wedding cake with the inner circle down to the surface. And if you'll notice right here, it gives you the altitudes, and that's from surface up to 4,500 feet. And then this outer circle, it's kind of hard to find on this one, but it actually shows you that it goes from, I'm trying to find the exact, lost it. You'll notice that that's the tough thing about some of these charts, that is finding the details embedded.
Is that it?
Yeah, right there. I knew where it was. So we have surface to 4,500 feet right here is listed. And then from 2,100 to 4,500 feet is the altitude in that outer ring. So technically, again, you could, if you launched out of Kyle, had a northwest wind, you could fly underneath that shelf. Notice that if you've got some approach control frequencies in these white boxes in the upper left and lower right. And then there's also a tower frequency right here that says control tower 121.0. You can also see the terminal information service if you want to get the weather for Austin Bergstrom. That is also depicted here, 124.4. If you wanted to actually check the weather for Austin Bergstrom while you're flying, if you're flying in that vicinity. Same thing applies up here. We'll talk about that in a minute when we get to Class D. All right, so again, ATC clearance is required to enter that airspace. ADS-B is required. If you needed to fly through for some specific reason, maybe you had some a demonstration or something that you could request a waiver from Austin Bergstrom, but I'll defer that to another day. Weather minimums, though, is a critical factor here that we need to consider. Visibility is 3 statute miles. Cloud clearance, you need to remain 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above, and 2,000 feet horizontal to be legal in Class C airspace. And this is actually going to play out here in a minute when we get down talking about D and E and G. If you were to be blown through this airspace and you thought you were legal flying with, you got 2 miles of visibility and you're remaining clear of clouds, and all of a sudden you find yourself down in this corner of Class C airspace, you very well could find yourself a subject of an FAA investigation. This is why we need to remember that that while we try to avoid controlled airspace, there are those situations where you might find yourself in the situation that the weather may be marginal, and that you would perhaps need to land or or at least, I guess, fly lower to avoid entering that airspace, the Class C airspace or the Class E underneath it, that could cause a violation. I know those are difficult conversations, but part of the reason we're having this briefing. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. Is that flickering right there? Mm-mm. Okay. All right. So moving on from Class C, Class D is very similar in that we've got a control tower and we've got ATC control of that airspace. And generally speaking, most of the aircraft in there are going to have ADS-B or a traditional transponder going. So the tower knows all the fixed wing aircraft that are coming and going. You're not required to fly. You can actually request entry into Class D without a transponder. And most of the towers will allow you through traffic dependent. So flying into and out of someplace like San Marcos Airspace down here, or further up north, Georgetown, especially at dawn when it's probably not too busy. Let me get back to that, sorry. Right up here, if you're flying, for whatever reason, you might be flying to North Austin. You got Georgetown, there's a Class D. You can see this dotted line around the Georgetown airport denotes a Class D, and that's it's a blue dashed circle. Same thing with down here at San Marcos, blue dashed circle. Perfectly legal for you to fly through there, but you must make radio contact. So you got to carry an aircraft radio and plan to talk to somebody before you enter that. And that goes from the surface, and you can tell it's Class D, not just by this blue dashed circle, but also by the fact that it has this, see this box here that says 3-1, which is 3,100 feet, which is the top of that airspace. So if you're going to clip through the edge, you get a southerly wind out of Kyle, and you start heading south, you're right on the edge of San Marcos, and technically, to avoid being violated, you would need to contact the San Marcos Tower. With Class D, you simply need to make contact, and they need to acknowledge that they've heard you, and you can continue along your path. That's different than Class C, which requires them to provide you clearance before you enter a Class C airspace. But probably aren't going to fly into Class C Austin Bergstrom, but you might clip the edge of San Marcos if the winds shift on you. And so that's something to keep in mind, that you're flying, if you have winds out of the north and you're flying across this edge, that you would need to make radio contact, even though you might be perfectly legal to fly into that Class D airspace. Again, Class D airspace, like Class C, has the 3-mile visibility requirements. And the cloud clearance, again, you need to remain 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above the clouds if you're flying in and out of clouds, or 2,000 feet horizontal. Of course, right now, we used to be just Georgetown and San Marcos, but now Austin Executive up north has really kind of boxed in that airspace that we might use in and around Hutto as an example. So I'm moving the map up here, and you can see, look how cluttered it is now with we've got Taylor, which is essentially a Class E airfield. You've got Austin Executive and then Georgetown, both Class D. And then you have all this in the Class C to the south, and then the other lower threshold Class E airspace, which are these shaded areas all around. There's really not much, it's very hard to fly in North Austin or in South Austin without coming across some designated airspace. And now we're starting to get down into the weeds and start talking about the airspace that we mostly fly in, and that's going to be Class E. And Class E is really just general controlled airspace, and it's everything that's outside of what we've talked about, outside of A, B, C, and D. And it's above Class G, which is uncontrolled airspace. We'll talk about in a second. So Class E is typically starting at 1,200 feet, or in the shaded areas that we just looked at, 700 feet. So again, if you look around here, almost anywhere, if you launch out of Kyle, if you launch out of Hutto, you're going to be probably covered by this Class E 700-foot airspace, which means that you have to comply with the main concern is the weather restrictions for Class E, which again are 3 statute miles visibility, cloud clearance 500,000, 2,000, and 2 miles is just not enough. It may be enough for you to fly safely in a balloon, but if for whatever reason there were an incident, or if an aircraft were to pop out of the clouds or whatever, maybe on a flight plan, under IFR, and there were some sort of close call, and the weather is documented to be less than these limitations, then obviously there could be an FAA enforcement consideration. So I know we all like to think that we're flying in Class G, which is, moving on to this next slide, we all think, Class G, which is near the surface, basically has a one statute mile visibility and clear clouds. But frankly, there's very few places we can fly around here for any given period of time. We can't really fly a 1-hour flight, let's say 8 to 10 miles or more, without coming in contact with or coming across Class E down to 700 feet. So it's not even really practical to scud run underneath those weather minimums. And I think I'm just the messenger here. I've read numerous posts from quite a few pilots. The one that recently, after the major incident in Albuquerque, Scott Appleman of Rainbow Riders put out an email admonishing pilots to pay close attention to these weather restrictions, because the FAA is quite serious about violating the 3 statute miles and cloud clearance rules that we may have stretched to the limit in the past. So especially if you're going to be in Albuquerque, or if you're going to be in at a rally or someplace where the FAA might be around, that's obvious that we need to comply with these rules. But even playing around the fringe around here, you could have ATC get a report, a PIREP from a pilot that's especially one that's on an instrument clearance, especially if there's a close call. In the past, we probably wouldn't have seen that sort of enforcement action, but from what I've heard, there's more likelihood that the FAA would actually come and have a chat with you about your weather briefing. Now, what were your weather minimums when you took off, and what they were in flight? So, I don't mean to be the bad guy here, but I'm just the messenger. There are quite a few articles and emails that I've read that people have expressed a serious concern about long rulemaking that may come out of some questionable decisions on weather. So keep in mind when we're flying, we take off in Class G airspace from the surface up to either 700 feet around all these airfields, or up to 1,200 feet. It's, if you're bobbing up into Class E airspace, you must comply with those weather restrictions to be legal. And this is just an example of an air, just to remind us that that shaded area around these small airfields doesn't seem significant, but technically, if you're cutting across the edge of that airfield, you must have 3 miles and the appropriate cloud clearance. And again, that's principally for safety. It's not just to comply with the FARs. It's really for safety, because you may have an aircraft, typically in the morning you don't see that many, but you might have an aircraft taking off or returning, maybe on an instrument flight plan, and may not be looking for you. And, they pop out of a cloud, and lo and behold, there you are with, maybe 1 mile visibility and not quite enough time for that aircraft to, well, if they have to take evasive maneuvers, they're probably going to let ATC know about that. So anyway, this is, I borrowed this from Adam McGee from the Balloon Training Academy. This is his chart. There are a few exceptions to the things I've already mentioned. For instance, if you're flying in Class E and there's nothing else around, if you go above 10,000 feet, you do need 5 statute miles and greater cloud clearance limits, 1,000 above and below, and 1 statute mile horizontal. If you're, and then obviously in the different categories of C, D, E, and B, these are the limits that we've already talked about: 3 miles, 500, 1,000, and 2,000. Now, one note on the Class B, it says clear of 3 miles and clear of clouds. That assumes you're under ATC control, and that's why, even though Class B is highly restrictive, it requires positive control and radio contact with the controllers, and they've got, in theory, they've got everyone on radar, and so that's why that's a lesser limit. Class G, we've already talked about that. 700 and 1,200 feet. Typically aren't going to fly nights. If you're going to fly nights, maybe if you're dawn patrol out at Albuquerque, then there's special briefings for those pilots to cover exactly what the waiver entails and what the restrictions are at Albuquerque for dawn patrol. But otherwise, you're probably not going to be flying at night, except for the gas pilots. And I'm going to defer to them for any other comments on that subject. And to wrap up, I did want to mention NOTAMs and notice to airmen and temporary flight restrictions. These are non-charted obstacles, limitations, flight restrictions, and such that are case-by-case basis on a daily basis. One of the biggest things lately is the unmanned aerial systems, UAS. They pop up all the time. I see these NOTAMs daily, and they'll be, they'll advise of us. Typically, they're under 400 feet, but not always. But especially they're, in many cases, if the firefighting activities and other flight restrictions will show up on the NOTAM and TFR page, I would recommend you go to the NOTAMs page on FAA.gov, and especially should be noted during, if you do your 1-800 weather brief, should note that. But I always do this before I get a weather briefing. I always go ahead and check the NOTAMs, look for all these obscure changes or updates, and check the TFRs and the NOTAMs. And again, with increased FAA scrutiny, if you were to inadvertently wander through an area that's been advised under TFR or under NOTAM, you could be subject to an FAA sanction for not fully without a thorough pre-flight evaluation or briefing. All right. Well, this is back to the airspace. I was kind of past my time, but I'll leave this chart up here, and I'll open it up for questions. And not only questions, but if anyone has any recent examples or encounters with the FAA or ATC that they'd like to share, I'd sure like to hear your stories. I've put everyone to sleep, I assume.
You're just very thorough at your explanations.
Well, it's a busy airspace, and I've talked to several people that, or read emails of situations that, whereas in the past we generally wouldn't have, you're flying out of, let's say you go up to Hutto up here. I mean, it's just gotten more. The airspace has gotten more dense. There's more population. I mean, especially, if you look at, if you're trying to stay away from populated areas and outside of airspace, it's kind of hard these days. So,
yeah, makes sense.
So I don't have I do not have the Albuquerque chart in front of me, but obviously there are quite a few restrictions. I didn't mention prohibited airspace. I mean, obviously, around Crawford or whatever, there's a prohibited zone. You're not supposed to fly over that. But once you get to Albuquerque, obviously there are going to be quite a few restricted red areas, and then other restricted areas that have minimum flight altitudes and other directions, and those are briefed, before flight operations begin, and they're all part of the waiver in Albuquerque. So those are some rather unique. I'd consider those TFRs as well, rather unique situations that that can present challenges for pilots that are not normally encountered flying out over the farmlands of Central Texas. All right. Anybody have any feedback? What about the gas pilots? What's it like flying? I know Sherry's probably got a lot of interesting stories about flying through ATC in Europe, but and I wish Brenda had the opportunity to do that this year as well. Unfortunately, that didn't work out, but. Okay. Well, like I said, I think I've gone over my allotted time. I'd be glad to talk with any of y'all offline, or if you've got any feedback, if there's any corrections to what I said, please let me know. And the main thing is fly safe and
check out the chat. Nathan put a kind of useful and interesting acronym on how he remembers the cloud clearances.
Yeah.
I think, actually that's chart up here. Adam uses the 111 rule there, but it's mostly 152. I mean, that's the standard cloud clearance. And remember, that's 500 feet below the clouds, 1,000 feet above the clouds, and 2,000 feet horizontal. And people go, why is it 500 below and 1,000 above? It's typically because aircraft descending are descending slower through the clouds. And those cloud levels are usually flat and closer to the ground. And so basically, my rule of thumb is I need 3 miles and 1,500 feet, so I can stay 1,000 feet above populated areas and 500 feet below clouds. but everyone's got their own rules. But the 152 rule is what Adam uses here on on Class E airspace. So.
Oh, Brenda says the America's Challenge has a FAA waiver exempting them from ADSP.
Oh yeah, and I think we've got a feedback from Brenda. That's not uncommon. The ADSB waivers, they're actually, if you want to do a record flight, a sort of challenge flight, and go above 18,000, there are exemptions. We've heard of some people getting exemptions using a traditional transponder instead of ADSB, and likewise. For the America's Challenge, I noted that, and I were, flying across the country, transponders can be used. There are waivers for those, that equipment instead of ADSB.
All right. Any other questions, Mike? Thank you very much. Very interesting. Good reminders. Good new information.
I'm just a messenger, but stay safe.
Well, that's what we need.
That's
is
right.
a messenger.